A very warm welcome to this webinar on behalf of the OU Palestine Solidarity Group. The title of this webinar is How Anti-Semitism Has Complemented Zionism. So in a moment, I will hand over to Les, who will provide more context to the topic and will introduce our speakers. For now, in order to ask a question, please go to the right-hand side of the Teams chat and choose question from the drop-down list. If we do get a lot of questions, we will need to be selective, so apologies in advance if your question is not addressed. You can like other people's questions too, if you'd like them answered. In terms of the code of conduct, I'm about to put this into the Q&A area, but just to be clear, we request that everyone uses respectful language. We will not accept any form of discrimination or harassment, whether based on race, gender, sex, sexual orientation, beliefs, age, disability, religion or lack thereof, or socioeconomic background. And we encourage anyone who has experienced or witnessed any form of discrimination or harassment during this webinar to alert us. So now I will hand over to Les. Thank you very much.
Welcome again, everyone, to this webinar on how anti-Semitism has complemented Zionism. I'll give a brief introduction before we bring on the four speakers who were advertised. Since the late 19th century, the Zionist project has been promoted as an essential refuge and defense against anti-Semitism. Yet, Zionist leaders have regularly colluded with anti-Semitism. They even welcome this threat as an opportunity to recruit more supporters, on the basis that Jews could be safe only in their own state. Zionism originated from Western philosemitism, which took various forms. As the earliest form, in the early 19th century, a Christian racist movement idealized the so-called return of Jews to the Holy Land in order to bring about the second coming of Jesus, when all unbelievers would die. Such Christians became early advocates of a Jewish homeland there. From the start of Jewish Zionism in the late 19th century, leaders have seen anti-Semites as important allies in supporting and motivating Jewish immigration to Palestine. Zionist leaders embraced racist stereotypes of Eastern European Jews as backward and so needing cultural uplift through a Jewish state. Likewise, a stereotype of Jews as not belonging wherever they live and so needing a Jewish ethno-supremacist settler-colonial state in Palestine. Zionism has philosemitic origins, which continue today in various religious and secular forms. Some idealizing Jews, some not, but in various ways providing support for Israel. Its stronger supporters today include anti-Semitic regimes and movements around the world. In the USA, 50 million evangelical Christians comprise the largest support base of the Israel lobby. Many are anti-Semitic within a more general racist outlook. They identify with the ethno-supremacist basis of Zionism. They see the regime as a crucial bulwark and frontline against the Islamist threat to Western values, whatever they may be, which on closer inspection turns out to mean white supremacy. Western states idealize and particularize Zionist Jews as, quote, the Jewish community, in that singular sense, while marginalizing pro-Palestine Jews or even stigmatizing them. In recent decades, mainstream institutions have recast anti-Semitism as hostility to Israel, supposedly as a disguise for hostility to Jews. Israel's apologists have called this the new anti-Semitism, portraying all anti-Zionists as suspected or actual anti-Semites. So, such people face the burden of evidence to demonstrate that they really are comprehensive anti-racists. This shift in focus serves to sanitize or ignore pro-Israel anti-Semites. Many Holocaust survivors have seen an analogy with Nazi Germany and Zionist colonization, and they drew the lesson, never again to anyone, they became anti-Zionist activists. One such person was Hajo Meyer, who popularized the following quip: "Anti-Semites used to be people who disliked Jews. Now they are people whom Jews dislike." Of course, he meant whom pro-Israel Jews dislike, including fellow Jews such as himself. This shift towards equating Jews with Israel, and thus equating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, has diverted attention from the main anti-Semitic forces, which have increasingly supported Israel for racist reasons. Such politicians have been regularly celebrated by the Israeli regime. So, with that brief historical sketch, in all those ways, anti-Semitism has complemented Zionism. Well, why has this happened? Driven by what forces? As a plausible reason, this shift helps Western imperial, neocolonial, white supremacist domination to support Israel as an imperial outpost, while also claiming to protect Jews from anti-Semitism. In this way, the political agenda can extend its control, both in the Middle East, in the imperial centers, and globally. So, time for the four speakers. Each should keep within 15 minutes, and then that will be followed by questions. You should see a Q&A facility on the screens. I see it at the top. It may be instead on the side, but wherever it is, just use that and try to put your comments as questions. We're more likely to select them if they do. So first, Tony Lerman, who is author of the book, "Whatever Happened to Anti-Semitism? Redefinition and the Myth of the Collective Jew." So, Tony, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, and put on your, yeah, we see your camera. Good.
Yeah.
And,
Okay.
and everyone, I think you can choose the view. If you say view speaker, then you can see him more
Yeah.
clearly.
Well, I'm very happy to start, although it's maybe slightly peculiar because I know that Tony Greenstein is going to do sort of historical more background, and I'm focusing very much on the current situation. But if you've set it up this way, then I'll go straight in. And also, Les, you've helped me a lot, because some of the things that are in my talk you've already covered, and so hopefully those people listening in will, by the time they've heard me as well, they'll know the picture pretty well. So let me get going. Thanks for inviting me to be here and to give this talk. What I'm going to do in the brief talk is to trace the increasing modern complementarity between Zionism and anti-Semitism since the early years, the adoption of what came to be known as, and you've already mentioned this, quote unquote, new anti-Semitism, that is the alleged equation of anti-Zionism or critique of Israel with anti-Semitism, by the Israeli state, leaders of Jewish communal institutions, Zionist organizations, and anti-Semitism organizations, and numerous other bodies. This process is what made possible the invention and adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism, a document in which that complementarity is in fact enshrined. And to be frank, we really have to acknowledge we've arrived at a situation in which the modern complementarity between Zionism and anti-Semitism is complete. How then did the two come to be locked in a deeply damaging dependent relationship, but one that serves Israel's interests well? There are various factors, but the key development came in 1988, when Israel's Likud government, then headed by Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, decided to establish a government agency to closely track incidents of anti-Semitism around the world. Called the Israel Government Monitoring Forum, its director was Eliakim Rubinstein, the Israeli government cabinet secretary, who proposed the idea. Now, given the prominent role Israel now plays in maintaining and deploying weaponized anti-Semitism, you might well wonder why no such body already existed. But indeed, as has already kind of indicated, the answer is actually quite straightforward. While anti-Semitism was a useful recruiting sergeant for Zionism before the state was established, the Zionist narrative was that Zionism's realization would bring an end to anti-Semitism. Jewish immigration to Israel remained the Zionist solution for diaspora Jews still facing anti-Semitism. To acknowledge that it still existed and could be lethal would undermine the Zionist case at a time when criticism of Israel at the UN, in the non-aligned movement, and in the Third World, as it was then called, was growing. The first time that anti-Semitism was mentioned in an Israeli government resolution, was in 1970. In 1975, when the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 3379 declaring Zionism to be a form of racism and racial discrimination, the government's formal denunciation of it made no mention of anti-Semitism. A sign of change came after the bombing of the synagogue in Rue Copernic in Paris in 1980, killing 4 and wounding 46, when the government declared that, quote, there is no distinction between anti-Israel and anti-Zionist phenomena and anti-Semitism, end quote. Nevertheless, there is no mention of anti-Semitism in government resolutions again until 1987, a year before the Monitoring Forum was set up. And the forum came into being against a background of mounting discussion in Jewish Zionist academic and intellectual circles about the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, prompted principally by the increasingly vocal left-wing and liberal support for the growing Palestinian and pro-Palestinian movements. By the mid-1990s, while there were always dissenting voices, a consensus was developing in these circles that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism were one and the same. This consensus was solidified post 9/11, by which time alleged Muslim anti-Semitism was coming to be seen as a major threat, with its emphasis on criticism, many said hatred, of Israel, an assessment, of course, heavily influenced by Islamophobia. The aims of the forum were highly ambitious: to put Israel at the front of the worldwide anti-Semitism monitoring being carried out by Jewish defense groups in various countries. The leadership of this effort was undertaken by the Mossad, with Mossad operatives working out of Israel embassies worldwide and acting as liaisons with the Jewish defense groups. Its task was by no means confined to monitoring. From the outset, they sought to engage young Jews in this combating anti-Semitism work and to ensure that they absorbed the Zionist message that the ultimate solution was emigration to Israel. And during the 1990s, increasing pressure was exerted on the Jewish groups to place attacks on Israel and Zionism as high and eventually the highest priority in their monitoring. Crucial to the aims of the forum and the Mossad from the outset was to have an academic body in Israel giving cover, respectability to their efforts and the notion of the new anti-Semitism through international seminars, annual anti-Semitism reports, and academic studies. The vehicle for this was the Project for the Study of Anti-Semitism, set up at Tel Aviv University in 1988, directed by the professor of Jewish history, Dina Porat, and it was funded in large part by the Mossad itself. When this became public knowledge after a couple of years, Porat and her government and Mossad backers faced embarrassing criticism, as significant academics strongly argued, understandably, that the project's credibility as an objective academic institution was seriously compromised. Mossad funding then came to an end, and the university stepped in to fund the project. Porat was fully behind the government's and Mossad's Zionist agenda. This agenda also included the exclusion of non-Jewish, usually leftist bodies tracking anti-Semitism and Jewish bodies which cooperated with such organizations, one of which was the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, which I was directing at that time. Initially, the Israeli government's agenda was not universally to the liking of many of the Jewish monitoring combating bodies. They were not comfortable with the quality of the data and analysis distributed confidentially by the Mossad or that of the Porat-headed institute. But after 9/11, any residual doubts melted away, especially once the major US Jewish organizations such as the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, and the Simon Wiesenthal Center, hardwired with support for Zionist objectives, gave full backing to the Israeli government's leadership-seeking policy. This also applied in the UK. The Board of Deputies of British Jews Defense Department, already in effect self-governing by the end of the 1980s, formally became an independent charity called the Community Security Trust in 1995. By the end of the century, its initial reluctance to follow the Israeli government's lead had been abandoned. By the early 2000s, the Government Monitoring Forum had identified as the main anti-Semitic threat the quote-unquote new anti-Semitism, even though there was still much debate in academic circles as to the justification for this decision, for this policy. Nonetheless, Jewish leadership bodies seen as or claiming to be representative of Jewish opinion, as well as mainstream Jewish religious organizations, signed up to the view that new anti-Semitism represented the principal security threat to Jews. This is highly significant in respect of the advance of the modern complementarity between Zionism and anti-Semitism. Broadly speaking, Jewish organizational voices ready to spread alarm about anti-Semitism were muted during the 1990s in the UK. To embrace multiculturalism in this decade was apparent in most of the new leaders of the traditional representative organizations, in the growth of organizations focused on Jewish culture and social justice, as well as in creative and more inclusive religious Jewish education focused on Jewish continuity, but also apparent from the first high-level academic social research on Jewish attitudes carried out by JPR, the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, was a marked weakening of attachment to Israel and Zionism in the younger generation. Communal power brokers who remained fiercely attached to Israel and Zionism, many of whom were of a younger generation and found themselves sidelined, were alarmed by JPR's findings and were suspicious of multiculturalism. Influenced by Islamophobia, they saw in it Muslim anti-Semitism in the fast-growing Muslim communities in the UK. They saw this also in multiculturalism and growing Muslim populations in the EU, and judged it to be constituting a Europe-wide Islamic threat. The view that anti-Semitism was on the rise, that young Muslims were largely responsible, and that the target of their hate was the Israeli state, a view that the Forum and the Porat Institute were promoting with increasing vehemence, became, by the end of the decade, the default position of all the Jewish defense organizations in the network that the Forum, through the Mossad, had created. In the post-9/11 febrile atmosphere and panic about the alleged explosion of anti-Semitism worldwide, in the UK, the hawkish Jewish leaders came to power in old and new organizations and were therefore very comfortable with the government Forum Mossad agenda linking the propagation of Zionism with anti-Semitism fear-mongering. In the Israeli Zionist narrative, 9/11 became first and foremost an anti-Semitic act, validating the assertion that anti-Zionism, hatred of the Jewish state, was now the principal and most dangerous form of anti-Semitism facing Jews, making Jewish survival and destiny linked ever more firmly to the fortunes of the Israeli state and the extreme messianic ethno-nationalism coming to dominate political and ideological discourse in the country. Weaponizing anti-Semitism, hijacking Holocaust memory, equating Zionism and Judaism, propagating the myth of Israel as the collective Jew, putting Israel in the forefront of Bush's war against terror, essentially a war against Islam, all these things proved highly successful in deflecting world attention from Israeli apartheid, ongoing dispossession of Palestinians, and widespread human rights abuses. From the early 2000s, we see this agenda being pursued in increasingly institutionalized forms. An Israeli government minister was made responsible for policy on combating anti-Semitism. International conferences were organized. A new Ministry of Strategic Affairs was established to handle the issue. At the same time, non-governmental bodies in Israel and outside, anti-Semitism institutes, watch and monitoring bodies dedicated to combating anti-Semitism, focused on anti-Semitism in the UN, for example, burgeoned, leading to what one scholar has called an anti-Semitism transnational field of racial governance. To a great extent, the new anti-Semitism was the main focus of this expanding field, with considerable attention given to how to define precisely what it is. Promoters of the notion of the new anti-Semitism argued that people in the field and concerned observers were clamoring for this new definition, but there was actually no evidence of this. Moreover, critics of the notion argued that this process was in effect a wholesale redefinition of anti-Semitism for no good reason. Demand for it was, they argued, to serve the Zionist agenda. And we know full well how central to linking anti-Semitism and Zionism this redefinition process became, with Government Minister Natan Sharansky, then head of the government's Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism, who in 2004 came up with his nutty but indefensible 3Ds test of when criticism of Israel becomes anti-Semitic, when it's demonized, for example, comparing Israelis to Nazis, judged by double standards, and delegitimized by denying its right to exist. Then came the European Union Monitoring Center working definition in 2005, heavily influenced by Professor Porat and major diaspora Jewish, Zionist, and representative organizations, which morphed into the IHRA working definition in 2016, and still maintains a stranglehold on what publicly across the globe is considered to be anti-Semitism. Essentially, IHRA exists and is so influential because it incorporates the complementarity of Zionism and anti-Semitism. So to conclude, the complementarity serves to maintain very effectively a racist colonial agenda. It is true, however, that revulsion at the genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gaza and the West Bank now have resulted in the galvanizing of mass support for Palestinians and the human rights they're denied. And that is a positive development. But the answer to how to exploit that to break the complementarity remains elusive. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. That's great. So let's move on to the next speaker. So next, Barnaby Rain, who is a PhD candidate at Columbia University, originally from this country and now again living here. He's author of several relevant articles, including one on Jewphobia in the journal Salvage. And the publications I'm mentioning were all in the publicity that was circulated before. So, Barnaby, the floor is yours.
I don't seem to be able to turn my camera on, so I'm very sorry about that. So I'm just going to speak to you without that because that doesn't seem to be working. But I'm glad everyone can hear me. So I'll just start because I've got a lot to say and I want to get through it in time. Why the panic across the West today about Jews? I want to suggest that in fact it has very little to do with Jews, and that the panic is compelling to people because it offers answers to wider anxieties that characterize our moment. And seeing things this way will reveal, we'll see in closing, a relationship between Zionism, anti-Semitism, and today's new anti-Semitism that will seem a little ironic. So first, the new anti-Semitism offers, I think, an explanatory framework for addressing connected economic, geopolitical, and demographic angsts, which are not all about Jews and not really at all about Jews, and they're not even only about Israel. So first, the economic. In the long crisis of neoliberal technocracy since 2008 and the return of anti-elitist politics in various forms. Now, an image of anti-Semitism as the unique prejudice that punches up, imagining Rothschild bankers controlling the world, sees the Labour MP Siobhan McDonough warn that anti-capitalism is intrinsically anti-Semitic. This is the old claim about a socialism of fools, deployed now to cast suspicion on all socialism. Anti-Semites, says the Guardian columnist Jonathan Friedland, see politics as, quote, a battle between the virtuous masses and a nefarious, corrupt elite. Unless we be in any doubt about how widely the anti-Semitic rot spreads, Friedland clarifies that, quote, plenty of Jews have themselves internalized it, including no less than Karl Marx, end quote. In France, Emmanuel Macron opines that Gilets jaunes protesters against fuel duty rises might be anti-Semitic. Internalizing the anti-Semitic picture of power as Jewish, this view defends power by recoding hostility to elites as racist. It reads anti-Semites as something like Nietzsche's revolt of the lambs against birds of prey. And following Foucault's provocative link between genealogies of class struggle and race struggle, this reading discredits the former by redescribing it as the latter. So it makes anti-Semitism, it makes anti-Semitism a convenient kind of anti-politics, a compelling way for those who mourn 1990s consensus to experience and to express their angst about the return of antagonism by associating it with spectres that everyone agrees are frightening, like Kristallnacht. So I think there is this kind of classic element of a projection of class conflict read as anti-Semitism in order to discredit it, which you saw a lot in the Corbyn years. You saw, for example, the headmaster of a private school claiming in the national newspapers that attempts to limit the role of private schools in national life that Corbyn was proposing were equivalent to Nazi laws and limiting Jews, and so on. So I think you saw this link being drawn where Jews, internalizing an image of power as Jewish, and the claim that anti-Semitism is that unique prejudice that punches up, gets you somewhere in dealing with the kind of crisis of neoliberal technocracy and articulating that crisis in anxious terms. Secondly, capital lives in national and imperial shells. So we might trace a line from Richard Storrs, Britain's colonial governor of Jerusalem, favouring a Zionist state in the 1920s as, quote, a little Jewish Ulster to please Britain's regional interests, to 1956, where Britain and France launched their neo-colonial invasion of Egypt from the Zionist state, to today, where the IHRA bans as anti-Semitic the diagnosis of that settler-colonial state as racist, mobilizing the memory of the Holocaust in a process that Tony has tracked so brilliantly in his book and that you've just heard him talk about now. Here we see the use of proclaimed anti-Semitism, claims to protect Jews, as a direct tool of colonial power, imperial, then settler-colonial. Its effect is to discredit anti-colonial politics. In David Baddiel's telling argument, the left disgraces its anti-racism when it fails to defend Jews on the terms demanded by the IHRA, which means defending a racist state. So consistent anti-colonialism is tarred with insinuations or worse of racism, and by implication, the new anti-Semitism legitimates colonial power by depicting the colonized as savages by virtue of their racism. So Palestinians are recast as racists when they object to their colonization, and anti-colonial politics in general, sympathy with the West's victims at a moment of fear and decline for the West, is recast as racist by positioning Jews as the protected minority of that declining civilization. So when the British state commissioned a former head of Labour Friends of Israel, John Woodcock, to write a report calling to ban both Palestine Action and Just Stop Oil, Palestine Action responded that Woodcock palpably represents the Israel lobby. As a former head of Labour Friends of Israel, he says that is evidence they are anti-Semitic and therefore they should be banned. Tony Blair warns that Jeremy Corbyn is of course an anti-Semite because, quote, his anti-West worldview demands it. And while Liz Truss threatens 10 years to save the West, the new anti-Semitism offers a vernacular at once anxious and proud for communicating that peripheralization of the old imperial core within the world system. The West's others are savages. This is not a new claim, but in the post-Holocaust, post-colonial, post-civil rights order, racialized savagery is a harder claim to make. So it is today recovered in a moment of ironic genius by accusing the savages of racism. That meets our strange times when racist power endures while everyone claims to be anti-racist. So accusing racial others of racism is thinkable as a strategy for defining the backward and the savage. The colonized and their supporters are bigots, and the West is now relegitimated by its claim to protect this protected minority, its Jews. And a view of anti-Semitism as prejudice, as a unique prejudice against power, makes it perfect to those ends. So economic, imperial, Thirdly, demographic anxieties. When I was canvassing near a barracks during the 2019 election, a veteran in Union Jack tattoos opened the door to tell me he would never vote for Jeremy Corbyn. Corbyn, he said, loves IRA terrorists and hates Jews. What image of Jews was involved for him here? Why was it intuitively compelling to him that someone disloyal to British imperialism in Ireland would also hate Jews? Over the last year, far-right counter-protesters have on several occasions targeted Palestine marches, talking of great replacement theory. So a conspiracy theory originally oriented around Jews is here used nominally to defend Jews from replacement, presumably by Muslims. Fringe fascists are only a kind of ideal type, but they iterate anxieties present too in the mainstream. The former immigration minister, Robert Jenrick, seeking the Tory leadership by opining on television that multiculturalism had failed, was asked to evidence that claim. His evidence, he said, was the Palestine marches in London. He said that Jews were now at risk because of multiculturalism, because of migrants and their children and grandchildren, whom he accused of, quote, clearly not sharing British values. An image of Jews is mobilized as a vulnerable group threatened by the savage hordes to defend both colonial and metropolitan racial hierarchies by redescribing the dominant power in those hierarchies as protective over the vulnerable. So that presentation works to legitimate horror at class politics and anti-colonial politics in these twin crises of neoliberalism and American unipolarity. And it also offers a subset of that more general anti-migrant politics, which increasingly provides the core purpose of the right in the global north. So that this anti-Semitism ambivalently self-presents as anti-racism, but in truth, it now constitutes an important weapon in the arsenal of European racism. All this emerges from a classic strategy wherein powerful actors legitimate their power by painting it as protective over vulnerable people. The word patriarchy was widely used in early modern Europe to denote the protection of women and children by men, whose violence was described as necessary to ward off threats to those vulnerable populations. In fact, of course, that male violence, patriarchal violence, constituted the threat. In America's Jim Crow South, lynchings frequently followed rape charges, with racial power justifying its violence as necessary to protect vulnerable white women from aggressive black men. So Jews are treated in the new anti-Semitism like white women in that American experience. A particular fantasy of our vulnerability is necessary to the defense of racist power. In Europe today, another example, Islamophobia sometimes comes wrapped up in LGBT advocacy. First in the Netherlands, where the far right discovered this trick as early as the 1990s. Now in Britain too, with the Prevent agenda enforcing British values on the rest of us, starting in the school classroom and including preaching LGBT equality to Muslim students, supposing improbably that homophobia is not a British value. Racism is thereby constructed as an enlightened necessity to police a backward and homophobic other. And finally, Cy Englert has shown in Spectre how a logic, just like the one I'm describing, was used by the French state in Algeria to present Jews as its protected minority who would be harmed if Algerians won their freedom. So this is all to name an anti-racist racism. In truth, it's not our fictitious racial essence, but our usefulness to power that dictates this racialization. Eastern Europeans were stealing British jobs 2 decades ago, but now Putin bombs them, so British ministers find it convenient to invite Ukrainian families into their spare bedrooms. Likewise, the apparent whitening of Jews, such that we become worthy of protection, really represents our deployment as an alibi for 3 angsts: economic, geopolitical, demographic, 3 angsts of white society. We're used by Christendom for its separate ends. Jews are, to coin a phrase, human shields for the other agendas of imperial power. We're thrown into the line of fire to defend, and this isn't to remove agency and responsibility from Jews who go along with this very happily, right? But this is the structure, I think. We're thrown into the line of fire to defend Christian civilization in Asia, in West Asia, and we're then thrown into the line of fire all over the world by the settler state's explicit and constant insistence that it represents world Jewry. Look at him, blame him, it says. That insistence does precisely what human shielding always does. It says, you want to attack me? I think I'll be safer and I'll look nobler if I strap him to me and encourage you to attack him instead. The new anti-Semitism is not really about keeping Jews safe. It's about answering, communicating these other anxieties, especially racist anxieties. It's no more about keeping Jews safe than the moral panic about supposed Muslim pedo gangs is really about protecting children. Other hungers are satiated by the panic. Racializing Western power defends Jews only contingently, only insofar as we play the role it wants of us, which is why secular left-wingers and Hasidim, two groups that usually imagine they have little in common, both frequently find themselves outside the offer of protection, since both offer awkward reminders of Jewish worlds before and beyond embourgeoisement and Zionism. The sharp irony is that the new anti-Semitism constructs anti-Semites as it once constructed Jews. And this is where I want to get to. This is the reason for that whole kind of spiel. So Jews were named as Semites by the German publisher Wilhelm Marr in 1870 in a moment of lurid Orientalism. And the identification of Jews as Semites worked to identify us racially with Arabs as people liminal to Europe, lurking at its physical or metaphorical borders. Jews were not like Africans or Native Americans, people to Kant and Hegel without history. Rather, Jews were located within Europe's pores in its cities and ghettos, and Jews were here, but not of here, connected to others like them across borders and overseas, with no loyalty to the particular flag and monarch under whom they might happen to live, a dangerous fifth column. At their most radical, shorn of ties to nation, they might tear down that whole world of nations. They're not loyal to any. That is the Semitism that anti-Semites identified. It's precisely how Hitler spoke of Jews in Mein Kampf. In 1920, Winston Churchill put the point forcefully when he wrote that anti-Semitism was appropriate against bad international Jews, naming Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg, but through Zionism, Jews could become allies and policemen in the order of Western civilization instead. So we might wonder, who carries this treatment today? The anti-Semitism of old and the radical possibilities of Semitism? Well, in 1974, Huey Newton celebrated Black internationalism in just these terms in his classic essay on intercommunalism, championing a people without loyalty to the American state that kidnapped them, and seeing in that existence outside national belonging the possible subjective basis for radical politicization. Paul Gilroy ended the Black Atlantic by noting the same parallel between blacks and Jews, people of hybrid border-crossing identities. Is this not exactly how Robert Jenrick spoke of those Palestine protesters? A frightening fifth column, not loyal to British values, but to transnational communities of the colonized instead. Communities fashioned and refashioned by histories of domination and uprootedness. In the streets for Palestine, today's hated Semites are found. They come from Ireland or from India, from the Caribbean or Somalia, from every corner of the Arab world, many of them Jews too. In the multiracial city, they meet and forge new traditions. These diasporas terrify because they threaten to destabilize existing identities, British values. This has long been the fear of the rootless cosmopolitan Jew, shuffling from place to place and making revolutions there, turning all that is solid into air. Right-wing politicians in Britain today who talk of British values and then proceed to praise Jews do so precisely because they imagine anti-Semites as the Semites of old. So, to wrap up, one response to anti-Semitism is to accept its whole picture of the world, where Semites are a problem and Jews have to be cleansed of our Semitism in order to become acceptable to Western civilization. In the Zionist move, Jews have to leave Europe to become truly European. Herzl was a bourgeois assimilationist, eager for Jews to become Frenchmen or Germans, who then saw that Europeans had nation states, ideally colonial ones, and so like Cecil Rhodes, Herzl set out to make the desert bloom. This is the anti-Semitism that wants to cast off the skin of Semitism. Zionism agrees, this is the entanglement that I want to point out today, Zionism agrees that Semitism is a problem. In fact, Zionism today occupies an important position in Western civilizations. When Netanyahu spoke in US Congress, he said he was there to speak for civilization against barbarism. That's the rhetoric that put us, of course, in gas chambers. Zionism occupies an important position in Western civilization's war on Semitism, on all those who fit awkwardly into the West and who might seek to bring it down. They've even retitled Christian civilization, which they now call Judeo-Christian civilization, to conscript us into the project that ghettoized and exterminated us. But our answer to anti-Semitism should be, I think, to embrace what anti-Semites hate in us, to be harbingers, as we have long been seen, for the downfall of Western civilization. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, we'll have to read the transcript to follow your brilliant argument. That's great. So next we have Michael Richmond, who has written many relevant articles, including philosemitism, an instrumental kind of love. It's an ironic use of the word love, of course. So, Michael, floor is yours.
Thank you. I have to start with an apology. I haven't had as much time to prepare this as I would like because I have an 11-month-old. So the worry is that this is perhaps longer than the 15 minutes. So I'd ask moderators to just cut me off if you need to. But I've been sort of furiously chopping bits off as we've been going. Okay, so I want us to think about this phenomenon that's I think under-theorized and less considered, which is philosemitism. I think it's important to discuss and understand this concept because it bolsters Zionism. Indeed, as Les said in his introduction, it's crucial in the founding of Zionist ideology. And it plays a significant role in the current wave of anti-Semitism that has now reached such a fever pitch. Philosemitism is a racialization of Jews that often goes unrecognized. It certainly won't trouble the IHRA definition. Some defend it, saying it's a compliment or what's wrong with loving the Jews? And many Jews and Jewish organizations and the Zionist state will affirm and welcome this supposed love when it's in their interests to do so. This is about understanding the work of race, how it's constantly formed and reformed to order, manage, and exploit populations. We must view race through its relationship to history, to state power, to capitalist social relations, and to imperialism, while paying attention to certain specificities that different forms of racialization have. I do not claim that Jews alone are appropriated or that the supposed loving embrace philosemitism supposedly represents is entirely unique. As Fanon wrote at the start of Black Skin, White Masks, to us, the man who adores the Negro is as sick as the man who abominates him. My claim is that philosemitism has a long history, and how Jews and Jewishness have been represented or how they've been related to, and the meanings and relations of power that this has generated have ongoing relevance for our current moment. By now, we're growing familiar with some of the tenets of contemporary philosemitism. Jews are talked about in supposedly positive terms: uniquely intelligent, economically successful, communal and familial unity and organization. These are often simply inversions of traditional anti-Semitic representations of Jewish craftiness, controlling financial domination, or a clannish self-segregation. But there seems to be a maturation of the process. White Gentiles grow emboldened to speak on behalf of Jews or to represent Jewishness, including to discipline dissident Jews. This professed love or protection of Jews is used by Western states to discipline their populations or certain sections of them. Philo-Semitic identification with a particular vision of Jewishness is increasingly expressed through a subsumption of Jewish experience into defenses or celebrations of whiteness. Jewishness is made synonymous with everything from colonialism, Western civilization, or liberal democracy, making Jews into avatars and human shields for white supremacy. Huria Butelja addresses Jews in her book Whites, Jews and Us, saying, "It's true, you really were chosen by the West for three cardinal missions: to solve the white world's moral legitimacy crisis, which resulted from the Nazi genocide, to outsource Republican racism, and finally to be the weaponized wing of Western imperialism in the Arab world." We see different typologies of the contemporary philo-Semite. The self-congratulatory liberals who see themselves as anti-racists, the far-right admirers of the Israeli ethno-state. You have different national particularities producing variations on the theme. Unfortunately, we have to start with Germany. where fascist politicians with Nazi heritage can present themselves as fighters of anti-Semitism by claiming it all comes from Muslim immigration. This is a country that mass produces people who pretend to be Jewish, gain fame as Jews, but are later exposed to have been lying. A country where it's commonplace to enact Jewish religious rituals or wear Jewish religious dress in support of Jews or projecting what they want or imagine Jews to be. A country with a creepily high number of converts in German Jewish leadership positions, feeling emboldened to somehow be even more Zionist and racist. A Jewish cantor in a Berlin synagogue claimed in 2022 about the influence of converts in powerful positions, stating that too many Germans converted to expunge their guilt and to be associated with victims rather than perpetrators. She lost her job. In recent decades, there have been revivals of Jewish culture, food, and festivals in Eastern Europe, countries with very few Jews, but with lots of Zionist funding and propaganda. Such projects can emerge out of a liberal Gentile sense of guilt or loss. One example from Poland was a graffiti project called "I Miss You Jew," a phrase daubed on walls in areas where Jews has once lived. The people behind it wanted to project an inclusive civic nationalism by memorializing what had been a vibrant Jewish minority in Poland for many centuries. They also wanted to apparently reclaim the word Jew, that in Poland was just an insult. Philosemitic projects like this often produce a kitsch or anti-Semitic appropriation, objectifying and exoticizing Jews, usually in their absence. More often than not, it's about the feelings of the white Christian people doing them. A key, I think, to understanding philosemitism is being able to see all the ways in which it isn't really about Jews at all. Eliane Glaser writes of English philosemites in the 17th century, not declaring straightforwardly what they think of Jews, but rather comparing themselves or others with them. Christians rarely referred to Jews in a neutral, disinterested fashion. More commonly, they either used Judaism as a way of insulting other Christians, or they identified with Jews themselves. Glaser adds that such philosemitism could take the form of an instrumentality of Jewishness for Christians engaging in particular debates, and that because it could signify either perfection or corruption, Judaism was ideally suited to religious and political controversy, because it could be used both to bolster one's own arguments and to destroy those of the opposition. The Zionist project relies on the philosemitism that undergirds its historic alliances, but it's also premised upon maintaining an eternalist conception of anti-Semitism, the idea that all non-Jews are hopelessly and inevitably anti-Semitic. Despite Zionist ideology and Jewish colonization in Palestine preceding it by generations, the State of Israel became a redemptive ending to the Holocaust tragedy, which was tacked on to a trans-historical notion of Jew hate. Part of the Euro-American embrace of the Jews is representing Jewish plight and Jewish history as uniquely tragic, the racism we suffer as uniquely serious. Never mind that the oppression of Jews is almost exclusively a product of Europe and its history. In the West, philosemitism and Holocaust memorialization became central aspects of national identity in the latter part of the 20th century. As Enzo Traverso has argued, this civil religion of Holocaust memorialization refuses to understand its causes and refuses to apply its lessons to the treatment of racialized, migrant, and oppressed people in the present. We've seen in increasingly stark terms in Britain how this regime of race and damaging understandings of anti-Semitism and anti-racism leave Jews being presented, with many presenting themselves, as most threatened by Muslim, Arab, or Black people, by the left, and by anti-colonial movements. And the only defense of Jews is increasingly seen as coming from the racist state and the hard right. The term philosemitism, you guessed it, was coined in Germany in a late 19th century pervaded by anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was coined to affirm a proud and open hatred for the racial Semite, meaning Jews. Philosemitism attacked anyone who didn't hate Jews so openly by calling them Jew lovers. Most Germans accused of being philosemites were keen to shrug off the label. Even if they opposed anti-Semitic political factions, they generally adhered to the same anti-Semitic stereotypes. The terms of the debate in Germany agreed. Jews were a people apart, a problem towards which one couldn't be ambivalent. Despite being named in late 19th century Germany, however, we must understand the relations of philosemitism as building up over a longer period, developing layer upon layer of signification. The context is the proximity of Jews and Christians in Europe over the longue durée, a relationship of domination by Christian and secular power over Jews. The contours of these relations have shifted greatly over time, reshaped through centuries of ruptures within Christian doctrine, the development of modern states, nationalism, and capitalist social relations. Religious bigotry and persecution in medieval and early modern Europe hardened into a racialized anti-Semitism. But through these years, we can see forms of proto-philosemitism too. Medieval Christian Europe was a hostile environment for Jews, who were subject to classic forms of racial oppression. Limits were imposed on Jews' rights to own land, property, or weapons. They were forced to wear yellow stars or other distinctive clothing and were excluded from guilds and certain trades. With usury forbidden by the church, Jews had few roles besides money lending, for which they were punitively taxed, allowing monarchs to profit from the practice while morally opposing it and Jews. Mob violence and ritual murder arose from church teachings and from debtor-lender relations. Attempts across Europe to spatially segregate Jews and enforce restrictions on social and sexual mixing with Christians were increasingly formalized and intensified with the development of ghetto systems, first named in Venice in 1516. Segregation was meant to protect Christians from the malign practices and disease of Jews and to exert pressure on them to convert. Some ghettos included rich Jews, but most were characterized by poverty. One form through which favor was shown to specific Jews was through the elevation of court Jews. In the early modern period, especially in German and Austrian states, court Jews acted as bankers, moneylenders, and advisors to Christian rulers. The great German banking families were ruined in the 30 Years' War, so outside capital was sought, allowing existing Jewish networks in trade and logistics to move into high finance. Court Jews organized army supplies and state financing for war efforts. Escaping the ghetto, they had privileges over other Jews. Some received great honors and amassed great wealth, but this favor remained precarious. Court Jews were a means for rulers to make use of a loyal outsider, Jews who owed their elevated position to their direct relationship with the prince, and who posed no threat to their rule. Monarchs could play troublesome interests off against each other. Financing provided by court Jews was used to modernize the state and the economy, but also to lessen the power of the estates and guilds. Court Jews became especially associated with the corruption and largesse of the age. Non-Jews, rich and poor, were outraged by the luxurious lifestyles of rich Jews specifically, leaving court Jews vulnerable to capricious rulers who could choose not to repay their debts or to popular violence if the protecting ruler died. Here we see an important feature of the favor bestowed on Jews by ruling Euro-Christian powers, a racism not only of exclusion and segregation for most, but of exposure, hypervisibility, and scapegoating for others. Some relatives of court Jews converted and integrated into the ruling classes, escaping their Jewishness and maintaining their status. But often, as F.L. Carsten put it, as swift was the rise of many court Jews, as swift could be their decline. As Louis A. Kozer explains, often the Jew was thrown to the wolves, hung with the misdeeds of the previous regime. Even in his fall, he served his rulers, the guilds and estates who had bitterly opposed him not only as a competitor, but as a representative of the hated state, were now free to vent their resentment. A tiny church, crown, barons, and popular forces inflicted blood libels, executions, and massacres upon England's Jews in the 1100s and 1200s. Edward I, in debt and under pressure from Parliament, issued the Edict of Expulsion in 1290, expelling Jews and seizing their assets for the crown. A tiny Jewish presence remained, but the Jewish population didn't begin to grow again until Cromwell's Protectorate, when a group of Iberian Sephardic merchants requested permission to settle in England. They pled their case on economic and religious grounds, appealing to Puritan millenarian beliefs that Jews must gather for the approaching end times. Usury was now widely practiced among Christians, so what the merchants offered was access to Jewish trade connections that could help England compete with the rise of Holland. The Whitehall Conference was convened to consider the request, but no decisive outcome was reached. Cromwell saw the value of Jewish trading networks in the West Indies, where he was expanding English power. Yet while he and the monarchs that followed him saw the usefulness of Jewish financiers, it also led to tensions with other interests in the colonies and the metropole. England's Jewish population gradually grew, but was still precarious and only in the hundreds by 1700. A conspiracy theory spread in the 1660s that Jews wanted to seize St. Paul's Cathedral and convert it into a synagogue. Jews were maligned by proto-nationalist arguments that they couldn't assimilate and didn't belong. City of London merchants only saw competition and tried to have Jews expelled again. Even amidst such hostility, an element of philosemitism existed. Puritanism came with a drive to further reform the church. These zealous Protestants were more focused on the Old Testament, came to identify with the Jews of Scripture. This theoretical philosemitism of the 17th and 18th centuries held romantic visions of ancient Jewry. Some learned Hebrew and idealized the ancient Jewish agrarian republic as a model for the good society. Focus on the scriptural Jew led most to either ignore contemporary Jews entirely or to condemn them as a personification of the commerce they saw as destabilizing rural and national life. Adam Sutcliffe's description of this instrumental use of Jewishness may sound familiar to us. The relationship between philosemitic Hebraism and actual living Jews is then extremely complicated. Judaism was certainly widely used in the 17th century as a form of conceptual token, deployed for its particular theoretical authority in debates between the adversarial political and theological wings of Dutch and English Protestantism. By the 19th century, establishment historians in Britain had constructed a patriotic hagiography around Jewish readmission. As we've seen, Jews were by no means unambiguously welcomed back, and yet the mythology of Jewish return has continued to burnish Britain's conception of its own tolerance. In 1906, government figures and Jewish communal leaders commemorated 250 years since this readmission. This took place just as the 1905 Aliens Act was being implemented, Britain's first immigration controls specifically designed to limit the entry of Jewish refugees. The Prime Minister who passed the Aliens Act, Arthur Balfour, missed the celebrations, but in a letter he stressed Britain's importance as a philosemitic exception to European anti-Semitism. Had continental Europe followed the example set by this country for the last 250 years, its history would not be stained by many crimes and many injustices, which now stand on record as a perpetual reproach to Christian civilization. That in this country there is no Jewish question, that race prejudices and religious prejudices, which elsewhere play so disastrous a part in the social organization, are unheard of here, is due in no small measure to the fact that the Jews have shown themselves entirely worthy of the rights and privileges which they enjoy as citizens of this country, and that those rights and privileges have been granted to them in full measure. Gentile Zionist statesmen in early 20th century Britain were anti-Semites. Churchill, Lloyd George, Balfour, Lord Alfred Milner. Milner, probably the least known, was a colonial administrator and a key member of Lloyd George's war cabinet. He was a calculated supporter of Zionism, but deeply suspicious of the Jews. Milner was also the primary funder of the proto-fascist British Workers' League, a patriotic Labour faction that physically attacked Jews and anti-war socialists. The Balfour Declaration was partly brought about by these long philosemitic Zionist traditions, as well as the lobbying of elite Zionists, Jewish and Gentile. Balfour's boast that anti-Semitism didn't exist in Britain was widespread. Some Victorian Gentiles celebrated the first Jewish MP in 1858 as the crowning glory. However, Jewish emancipation, spreading unevenly across Europe, coincided with an era of totalizing racial ideology. The abstract Jew came to personify modernity to various disgruntled constituencies. Jews were associated with the downsides of capitalism and imperialism. Jewish individuals in the ruling class found themselves, like the court Jews before them, singled out as corrupting influences and were targeted by emerging European nationalisms. Amidst growing anti-Semitism, new forms of philosemitism flowered among a section of Britain's Protestant establishment.
You need to stop soon. Just another minute or two.
I have 2 paragraphs left, or should I just skip to the conclusion?
Yeah, I think go to the conclusion.
Sure, okay. Contemporary Zionism in the US has more Christian supporters than there are Jews on the entire planet. Zionism, philosemitism, and anti-Semitism are entangled here. Money and political support is funneled from settler colony to settler colony. Meanwhile, US evangelicals are the most devoted followers of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories like QAnon, white genocide, and whatever else George Soros is behind. Herzl wrote in his diaries that anti-Semites would become the best friends of the Zionists. In this, he was right. Philosemitism is not solidarity. We must break the vice-like grip of philosemitic Zionism over Jewish identity and Western relations with Jews that exist both due to Jews and to non-Jews. Anti-racist and anti-colonial struggle necessitates resisting the social control of the state and the community leaders empowered by it. As I've argued, philosemitism is not just part of the maintenance of the Zionist project, it is key to the management of race and of social control in Euro-America. The point is not to save ourselves or Jewishness, but to contribute to anti-racist, anti-colonial struggle and the liberation of Palestine.
Okay, thanks. Now to our final speaker, Tony Greenstein. Over 4 decades, he has written numerous articles relevant to the theme, and now, recently, he published a book, Zionism During the Holocaust, The Weaponization of Memory in the Service of State and Nation. So, Tony, floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Can you see me? Am I highlighted or? I don't know how you operate this. I hate Microsoft Teams, I have to say. I assume you can see me. Okay, thank you, Les. The title is particularly appropriate, How Anti-Semitism Has Complemented Zionism, because in reality, Zionism and anti-Semitism have gone together like Hansel and Gretel, arm in arm. We've heard from Tony Lerman and Barnaby as well about how the new anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism has been weaponized. But I think we need to be clear that this redefinition of anti-Semitism really is the property of our ruling classes and ruling elites. It hasn't percolated down to the mass of people. I mean, I wrote 30 years ago, over 30 years ago, in an anti-Zionist Jewish magazine, Return, which people have probably forgotten, an article, Anti-Semitism is the false anti-racism of the right. And I think we need to be clear about that this is a false anti-racism. And indeed, the reason why our rulers, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Keir Starmer, Donald Trump, etc., are so concerned about anti-Semitism is because of the virtual disappearance of anti-Semitism as a mainstream form of racism. It's precisely because Jews are not oppressed today, because they're not the victims today, that anti-Semitism is such a useful weapon. But if you asked, and I use the legal test here of reasonableness, the reasonable person, who is the man, I'm sorry, it's the law is very sexist, on the Clapham omnibus, what anti-Semitism is, then he will say anti-Semitism is hostility or maybe hatred or prejudice against Jews as Jews. He won't talk about opposition to the Israeli state as a Jewish state. So I think we have to get a sense of proportion. This is a narrative of the ruling class, of the imperialists. I mean, imagine, for example, Geert Wilders, the leader of the largest party in the Netherlands, the so-called Freedom Party. Where do you think Geert Wilders would have been in 1940, 1941, when the Nazis were rounding up Jews and attacking them in Amsterdam and in the Netherlands? Would he have been amongst their opponents? No, of course not. He would have probably been a member of the Dutch Nazi Party, the NSB. And the same goes for all the characters and the figures today. Would they have been opponents of anti-Semitism when anti-Semitism was a very real phenomena? Would they have been amongst those who opposed Oswald Mosley in the Battle of Cable Street in 1936? Of course not. I mean, I don't need to tell you that the Board of Deputies and the Zionists in this country and the Jewish Chronicle opposed any Jewish mobilization against the British Union of Fascists and National Socialists, to give it its full title, in 1936. The Friends of the Jews at that time, when Jews were being attacked as Jews, were the left, the communists, the socialists, the anarchists, and so on. It certainly wasn't their newfound friends today. So I think we need to sometimes come down to earth and show that there is a massive amount of hypocrisy and double talk and double think as well in the narratives that we are hearing today. And I think we also need to place what is happening in a context. And that context is that all settler-colonial societies have seen the reaction of the indigenous population as being against them in terms of their own identity. White South Africans saw black opposition.
Yes, no, I've changed my mind. Yes, I would like.
I think I've got competition. They saw opposition to apartheid as being anti-white. And the same was true with the French in Algeria. The same was true with the Protestants in Ulster. So this is nothing new. What is, if you like, distinguishes the anti-Semitism narrative from all others is that Jews have been able, or the Zionists have been able, to mobilize the memory of the Holocaust in defense of their own genocide. And they do that without even beginning to think that maybe when they talk about Palestinians as human animals, that was the actual phrase used by Heinrich Himmler in a famous speech at Posen on the 4th of October 1943 to senior SS generals, or when they talk about finish them off or exterminate them, or the most popular podcast in Israel, Two Nice Jewish Boys, talk about how wonderful it would be if they could press a button and erase all Palestinians at once. So there is no self-reflection by the Zionists as to the rhetoric that they use today. And of course, we know what's happening in Gaza. It bears every comparison with what happened in Nazi Germany. I actually have to add that the first stages of the Holocaust were the killing squads in the wake of the German army in Operation Barbarossa, where they killed maybe 1 million or more Jews by forcing them into forests, digging their own graves, undressing, and then shooting them so they fell into the graves. The reason why that was stopped was because of the psychological effects it had on the German SS. A senior SS general, von Dambelewski, approached Himmler at one point and said, "You're creating mental wrecks, psychopaths." And it was that which led, if you like, to the gas chambers. But the Nazis actually experimented with a number of forms of extermination or murder of Jews. One of them was actually blowing them up with explosives, but they found that was too messy and not efficient enough. I suspect that if they'd had access to 2,000-pound bombs of high explosives supplied by the Americans, which of course have been dropped on residential areas in Gaza. They may have thought twice about whether gas chambers were the most useful means of extermination, but that of course is speculation. What we do know, and I also want to say that settler-colonialism, indeed colonialism, has always had a sense of victimhood, and Zionism is not unique in that. I mean, the British Empire laboured under the illusion that it was the white man's burden. So we have to be clear that Zionism itself, and I'll deal with this in a bit more depth later on, has never fought genuine anti-Semitism. But as has been mentioned by a number of speakers, the first beginnings of Zionism were not Jewish, they were Christians. Indeed, the Jews were remarkably reluctant to adopt Zionism or the idea of a return to Palestine for the very simple reason that their fight here was for emancipation, which was granted in 1858. And it's interesting to just have a quick look at some of the stages, because the two most prominent imperial figures in the Christian Zionism, the marriage of millenarianism to political and strategic objectives of the British Empire, were Lord Shaftesbury and Lord Palmerston, who was a British Prime Minister. And it was on Shaftesbury's insistence that Palmerston in 1838 opened a British consulate in Jerusalem and appointed a vice consul there, William Young, who was titled the Protector of the Jews. And this was followed up by a lead article in the Times of the 17th of August 1840, which called for a plan to plant the Jewish people in the land of their fathers. When Palmerston approached the Board of Deputies also in August 1840 to inquire about possible Jewish cooperation in Jewish settlement projects, he was rebuffed. And in a resolution passed on the 7th of November 1842, the Board of Deputies resolved that it is, quote, precluded from originating any measure for carrying out the benevolent views of Colonel Churchill respecting the Jews of Syria, unquote. It was followed up, 1845, the Frankfurt Rabbinical Conference renounced the restoration idea, voting that all petitions for the return to the land of our fathers and for the restoration of the Jewish state should be eliminated from the prayers. And the Pittsburgh Declaration of Reform Jury of 1885 declared, we consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor the restoration of any laws concerning the Jewish state. And of course, Lord Balfour himself was a Christian Zionist. So Christian Zionism, the idea of the return of the Jews to Palestine, was not something that the Jews themselves had advocated. Indeed, Shaftesbury combined both anti-Semitism and Zionism. Shaftesbury was an opponent of Jewish emancipation in 1858. But Zionism itself, Jewish Zionism, when it began, it was really in 1881 as a reaction to the pogroms in Odessa. And the foremost figure, the founder of a group called the Lovers of Zionism, Leon Pinsker, wrote that anti-Semitism is a hereditary disease, is a mental disease, and as such, it is hereditary. And having been inherited for 2,000 years, it is incurable. And of course, he was a doctor. Of course, if something is incurable, then there's no point in fighting it. At best, you administer palliative treatment. And this was the Zionist attitude throughout, because amongst all oppressed peoples, there is always a section, and in America, amongst the black people, this was the Marcus McGarvey represented, who adopt the kind of framework of debate of their oppressors. Their oppressors say to them, you don't belong, you're a separate nation or people. And the oppressed, that section of the oppressed, also say, yes, you're right, we are a separate people. And that's what Zionism did. Zionism came to terms with anti-Semitism and accepted the fundamental premise that they did not belong, that they were guests in another people's country. And because of that, Zionism came to terms with anti-Semitism, and not only came to terms with it, it began to understand that without anti-Semitism, there could be no Zionist project. And Herzl was quite clear when he said, in the midst of the Dreyfus affair, the biggest fight and campaign against anti-Semitism in France, which rocked Europe, where a Jewish captain had been framed for treason. He said, and he was a Viennese journalist, he wrote in his diaries, "In Paris, I achieved a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism, which I now began to understand historically and to pardon. Above all, I recognized the emptiness and futility of trying to combat, inverted commas, anti-Semitism." And not only did Zionism accept that you couldn't fight anti-Semitism, it quickly came to the conclusion that anti-Semitism was in many ways justified. Jacob Klatskin, who was the editor of the Zionist organization paper developed from 1909 to 11 and the co-founder of the Encyclopedia Judaica, stated that if we do not admit the rightfulness of anti-Semitism, we deny the rightfulness of our own nationalism. Instead of establishing societies for defense against the anti-Semites who want to reduce our rights, we should establish societies for defense against our friends who desire to defend our rights. And that was the attitude of Zionists in terms of anti-Semitism. The anti-Semites said the Jews were a nation apart, and the Zionists agreed. The Zionists believed, as I said, that anti-Semitism could not be fought. And I give you another, well, I mean, there are many quotations about it, but the Zionists also came to adopt the attitude of the anti-Semites to the Jews, in that the anti-Semites were right to say that the Jews were asocial, that they had bad habits, that they were a dishonorable people. And again, I mean, I quote Jacob Klatskin, but there are many others who I could quote. And he said that the Jews were a people disfigured in both body and soul. In a word, a horror. At the very most, if it can maintain us in a state of national impurity and breed some sort of outlandish creature, the result will be something neither Jew nor Gentile. In any case, not a pure national type, some sort of oddity going amongst the peoples by the name Jew. And it wasn't just Klatskin. I mean, Hashem Hatzer wrote in The Young Zionist, the Jew is a caricature of a normal, natural human being, both physically and spiritually. As an individual in society, he revolts and throws off the harness of social obligation, knows no order or discipline. And Hashem Hatzer was on the far left of the Zionist movement. They claimed at one point to be Marxist Zionist. Jabotinsky, the founder of the revisionists, said the Jewish people are a very bad people. And I could go on giving such examples, but I'm not sure to what effect that would be. But there is an interesting comment by Jacob Doron, who is an Israeli political scientist. And I'm just trying to pull it up now.
You need to finish in a minute or
Right.
two.
Okay, yes. Jacob Doron, he wrote, it was an article, Classical Zionism and Its Enemies, in the Journal of Israeli History, number 8. He said, rather than take up arms against the enemies of the Jew, Zionism attacked the enemy within, the diaspora Jew himself, and subjected him to a hail of criticism. Indeed, the perusal of Zionist sources reveals a wealth of charges against the diaspora Jew, and this is the important sentence, some of which are so scathing that the generation that witnessed Auschwitz has difficulty understanding them. And that is really the point. And when people today say, and if you can just give me one more minute, Les, that Israel and Zionism have provided a refuge for Jews. We actually understand that when a neo-Nazi regime came to power in Argentina in 1976, the first neo-Nazi regime post-war, the Israeli state refused to say anything about the fact that it killed up to 3,000 Jews. It was not only did they refuse to say anything, they were actually arming and training the Argentinian military forces. And so Israel is absolutely, and Zionism is no defense against genuine anti-Semitism, which is why we have the absurdity of Netanyahu when he's arraigned or has an arrest warrant issued for him, saying that this is pure anti-Semitism. But I think most people can actually see through this. This is a narrative of our rulers. It isn't something which is a mass, if you like, has mass acceptance by ordinary people. And I'll leave it there, and thank you very much.
Okay, thanks to Tony and all four speakers. Now, there are some interesting questions that have been sent to us, but I'd like to start with a more general question which would be relevant to all the speakers, perhaps each in a different way, depending on their angle. And that is, given these complementary links between anti-Semitism and Zionism, which continue today, what have been the collective Jewish efforts to undermine those links? And what have been the new opportunities to do so in the rise of Palestine's solidarity activities? So, on the assumption that all four would like to say something about this, just go in turn through the original
Let's
order.
clarify that question a bit.
Okay.
Maybe I can catch it.
Okay. Well, given the complementary links between anti-Semitism and Zionism, as elaborated by all four speakers, each in your own way, what have been the collective Jewish efforts to undermine, to contest those links? So to perhaps promote a different version of what Jews are or should be, contrary to those stereotypes. And what have been the new opportunities to do so with the rise of Palestine solidarity activities over the past year? But you're welcome to go back further in history. So, I'll call on all four.
Shall I have a go first?
Yeah, yes.
You can then get me out of the way and the others can speak. Yeah, it's a very good question.
And turn on your camera if you can.
Yeah, sure.
I know there's a technical problem in some cases.
No,
but...
I'm there now, is that right?
Okay.
See you now. Yeah. Well, whatever has been done to separate the two in recent years, up to the last couple of years, up to the last 18 months or so, I should say, has not been very effective. I think you could argue in some ways that the pushback against the IHRA working definition was to some extent an expression of the attempt to pull the two apart. But I think, as I've argued, and others too, that that failed utterly, and the all attempts to undermine IHRA have been extremely weak, and so therefore have actually ultimately, I think, led to what I was sort of pointing out in my remarks about the sort of modern element of all of this, that these two things have become even more complementary because of the success of IHRA. But I do think that out of this ghastly, one can't really find the words for it, what's happened to the Palestinians in not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank. I feel that this has opened up an opportunity to develop a discourse of separation of these two things. And the question is, though, how to exploit it, how to further it. And I think that the problem here is almost, and I think perhaps some of the others have mentioned it, Michael in particular, maybe that here it's a matter of organizing and effective strategy in order to further this attempt to pull the two things apart. Because I think one of the things that was so disappointing in terms of IHRA was that the attempt to fight back against that, there was this one supposedly major effort, the JDA, in my view was a terrible strategic error, because it treated the people who were behind IHRA as if they were academics and wanted some kind of discussion about it. And of course they didn't. It was purely a political effort, indeed, to use anti-Semitism in order to prop up support for Israel and so on. So whereas I think now there is this greater awareness, there is this greater understanding in some respects of the Palestinian plight and the Palestinian position, and there has been a groundswell, however much it's been vilified by politicians here and elsewhere, and other speakers have mentioned this. However much that has happened, nonetheless, I sort of have some hope that this uptick in solidarity with the Palestinians might actually, be a basis. And certainly when you listen to Palestinian voices and the discussions Palestinians are having, and the thinking through of some of these things that Palestinians are doing, I think that there's a lot of hope that maybe a new narrative can be developed, which would lead to pulling these two things apart. But as we know, the Zionist machine, the Zionist behemoth is not so easily not so easily pushed off course, and one can have a little optimism maybe, but sadly not much.
Okay, thanks. And Barnaby?
Yes. So can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. I'm so sorry about my camera. I don't know what's happening, and in about 10 minutes I will have to shoot off, 15 minutes maybe. But it's exactly the right question. I think that over the last year, one sort of split that I've noticed in the movement has been, as liberal Zionism struggles amid a kind of polarization. And the worrying thing is that the polarization is happening certainly within the Jewish world in both directions. It's not just people coming over to our side. But as liberal Zionism withers on the vine, there is a kind of, I think, an emerging kind of liberal anti-Zionism, which is quite distinct from the radical anti-Zionism, from the revolutionary anti-Zionism that is obviously evoked by the Palestinian revolutionary movement for decades, and by those around the world in kind of anti-colonial solidarity with it. And I think in relation to Jewish identity, there are two very different claims at work. So that a liberal anti-Zionism says, okay, Netanyahu's gone a bit far, and maybe it's not just Netanyahu that's gone a bit far, but maybe this whole state thing was a bad idea. Let's think about Ahad Ha'am, or let's think about Martin Buber and histories of sort of writers of coexistence and binationalism and so on. and no more fundamental challenge to the meaning, the image of Jews in the wider canon of Western racism is involved here. We just say, you know, maybe we go on a demo, or maybe we don't because we're a bit scared. There are some extremists there, but we're horrified by what Netanyahu's doing. Of course we are. We're also horrified by Hamas, etc., etc., etc. And I think that there is an alternative to that, which refuses the racialization. You know, refusing racism is about refusing our racialization, the modes through which we're racialized. Refuses the recategorization of Jews as a protected minority of Western civilization, and insists instead that that the recovery of our history is the embrace of that position, which once saw us cast by anti-Semites as this terrifying challenge to their whole order. And that kind of refusing that recategorization is to be very comfortably and very confidently on the Palestine demonstrations, of course, and is also to say that actually when we look at that little slice of West Asia, we see our people less in the colonial settlers who evoke the memory of Cecil Rhodes, as Herzl once said, and more in those who resist processes of colonial settlement and ghettoization and expropriation and extermination, and that to see the image of the kinds of Jewish histories that we embrace less in Israelis than in Palestinians. Of course, Avi Schleim has been saying recently that's especially sharp and stark for those many citizens of the Zionist state, Jewish citizens who are Arabs themselves, but also for those of us who didn't have the good fortune of living mostly with Muslims for hundreds of years, but unfortunately had to live with white European Christians, and so faced ghettoization and then extermination. To identify the state of Israel, in other words, not as only a chapter of Jewish history, though Jewish history is a complex and multi-sided thing and includes lots of awful chapters, and this oughtn't to be about romanticizing an alternative Jewish position, but to see Zionism above all as a chapter in Western imperial and settler-colonial history, and therefore to refuse to be conscripted into Western civilization as its protected minority, and to see ourselves as Jews instead among the colonized and the diasporic, the migrants who Geert Wilders in Amsterdam says constitute the great threat to Western civilization, and so Moroccans should be deported. And in order to say that, which he's of course always wanted to say, he now says that he's doing it to protect Jews. It's important to refuse to be weaponized in that way as the alibi of white society, to recognize our people instead among all the other racialized peoples who are marked for exploitation, expropriation. Jews now serve a different role in that racializing hierarchy than low-wage labor, or to have our countries invaded, or but to refuse to be wielded in that way, and to make common cause instead with those, including those leading anti-colonial politics and anti-colonial struggle.
Okay, thanks. Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I go back to one of the periods that I was talking about in the kind of early, late 19th, early 20th century, you can see during a period of mass proletarianized sort of Jewish community within Britain, you had the example of that two-pronged attack where Jews were organizing as a working class who were having to both face British working class anti-Semitism, but also struggling against kind of the community leaders that were trying to control and manage them, and often colluding to send them back to places. That kind of model of class struggle and anti-racist struggle is of course the model that we need to aspire to, but that's more than 100 years ago, and obviously lots of things have changed, and the current position and composition of Jews within Britain has been impacted by lots of changes in terms of class position, in terms of migration, and that is you can't just try to transplant those kind of histories into the present. And I think, you know, what others have been saying in terms of like being present within you know, anti-racist struggles happening wherever Jews are, but also being involved in this constant struggle in terms of organizing, but also in terms of like you know, discourse and intellectual kind of work and production to take on, you know, how we are represented by most prominent Jews in each kind of national society that we're based in. And you know, the way to do that is kind of an open question in terms of like, you know, there's people have their own ideas in terms of both Jews on the left and Palestinians in terms of whether it's more effective for Jews to organize as Jews within Jewish leftist groups or not. I don't have like a clear any kind of clear prescription on what I think is right there. I think it's a time for, you know, doing as much as we can, because we're all living in a time of horror and genocide, but also a time for kind of constant experimentation with our struggle, you know, in terms of trying to find new ways to organize, new ways to relate to each other, and constantly trying to pull all of these issues back to how responsible countries like Britain and the United States always are in these issues, in ways that open up a lot more about where race emerges from, how colonialism is kind of so sprawling, and how related different histories are. I think that is something that is underdeveloped in terms of our organizing and reaching out to each other. I'll leave it there.
Oh, thanks. And Tony G.
Right, yes. Can you see me? Or
No, apologies. We'll have to fix the cameras next time.
yes, I think so. Right. Well, I mean, what I would say is, I go back to what Karl Marx wrote in the German ideology, that the ruling ideas in society are the ideas of the ruling class, because it expresses their dominant material interests and relations. And the anti-Semitism narrative is a narrative aimed at justifying their support for Israel as the armed watchdog, and worse, of Western imperialism in the Middle East. And that is not going to change. And so you have two narratives, the dominant narrative, and if you like, the counter narrative, the opposition to the IRA, opposition to the idea that hostility to Zionism means hostility to Jews. And that debate will continue because there are two irreconcilable sides. The problem in terms of Jews, of course, is that the Jews of the 1930s, the Jews who fought at the Battle of Cable Street and told the border deputies where to get off, are not the same Jews as exist today. Jews have moved upwards in society socio-economically, and they've moved to the right, and therefore they are receptive to the idea that anti-Semitism is now hostility to Israel rather than hostility to themselves. And they're able to do that because anti-Semitism itself as a form of state racism has disappeared. Anti-Semitism today is a marginal prejudice. It is not a dominant form of racism. Jews are not arrested because they're driving a car. Driving whilst black is reserved for black people or brown people. They're not the victims of disproportionate imprisonment and so on. And so anti-Semitism itself, having virtually disappeared, has been transmuted into opposition to the Israeli state. I mean, I give you an example. I mean, in the 1930s with the British Union of Fascists and the Battle of Cable Street and the terror on the streets of the East End, which was very real. I mean, the London police were riddled, the Metropolitan Police were riddled with anti-Semites and support for Mosley's British Union of Fascists. Today, they pose as the friends of the Jews. I mean, I was arrested at the picket of Tzipi Hotovely, the Israeli ambassador in London, when I conflated or compared what Israel is doing in Gaza with what the Nazis did to the Jews in Europe. Although the charges were dropped because they can't sustain that, that is, if you like, symptomatic of the problem that the IHRA, although not a legal definition, has in practice become part of the legal code in which anti-Semitism is seen as the major problem of racism for our ruling class, because of course there's no other. But I think we have to comfort ourselves with the fact that people like Suella Braverman, a bigot for every season, who talks about the invasion of migrants, where would she have been 90 years ago when anti-Semitism was a very real problem? Of course, she would have been on the side of the anti-Semites. And the same with all the bigots and reactionaries like Robert Jenrick today. So I don't think we're going to separate it, because there are two very different narratives expressing two very different interests. The interests of anti-imperialists and people who support the Palestinians, and the interests of our ruling class. So this debate will continue, and this narrative, this counter-narrative will continue as long as we exist in the society that we do. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to all the speakers. I mean, we extended this more recently by 15 minutes to allow more time, but now I think we have come to the maximum. I will just take the liberty of relating a semi-humorous anecdote about philosemitism. Now, Barnaby referred to the Jewish bloc, which we should explain. That since the mass protests began in October a year ago, the Jewish bloc was created to bring together all the Jewish pro-Palestine groups, regardless of their relationships to Zionism, explicit or implicit. And it's been an important development for visibility. But on one occasion, it had an ironic result, because we always meet on a side street, so we gather our force, and then we enter the march to be as visible as possible. On one occasion, a large number of police officers blocked our efforts to enter the march. Why? Well, we overheard an officer in the front speaking to his superior, "I found the counter-protest." No, they assumed that we were the pro-Israel contingent trying to cause trouble, because amidst all our banners, they could only see the word Jew. They couldn't see the word Palestine. It was invisible from their Zionist mindset, right? We're Jews, we must be Zionist. So it's just an example. And of course, when we passed around the word about that conversation, we all cracked up laughing and were ridiculing them as idiots. But it was a more profound problem, which we will continue to confront, as Barnaby put it, to embrace the original meaning of Semitic as here, but not of here. So perhaps we should conclude here. I thank everyone for their questions, which stimulated my idea for that general question about how people are trying to break the link between anti-Semitism and Zionism. So Farnaz?
Thank you, Les. So a huge thank you to our incredible speakers. Thank you also to all of you that have attended today. Please do check out the OU Palestine Solidarity YouTube channel for our previous webinars, and we look forward to, for you to join us for our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Les.
Thank you.
Thank you, OU.
Yeah. Goodbye.